Don't move. Keep those hands where I can see them." The hands were already up. They had been up before the words came, before the cruiser's door had fully opened, before Sheriff Brandt Holloway's boots had found the concrete of the Sunoco lot on Route 9, because Darius Ashford had learned the way certain men learn certain things without anyone sitting them down and teaching it. That in an encounter like this one, the first thing you do is make your hands impossible to misread, impossible to question, impossible to use against you. Later in a report written by the man pointing the weapon. Holloway was 54 years old, built wide and heavy. The way men built wide and heavy tend to carry themselves like the space around them already belongs to them and everyone else is borrowing it. His hair was platinum white, cropped short and clean against the back of his neck, catching the blue-red pulse of his cruiser's lights as he moved across the lot. His right hand had gone to his holster before his eyes had finished finding Darius, and once they found the weapon on Darius's hip, legally holstered, worn openly exactly as regulations required for active military personnel traveling on official orders, they stopped moving entirely. Fixed. Certain. As though the question had been answered before it was asked. Darius told him his name. He told him he was active military. He told him he was carrying, that the weapon was legal, that his identification was in his left breast pocket, and he was asking clearly, calmly, in the specific way a man asks when he understands that clarity is the only protection available to him in the next 30 seconds, how the sheriff would like him to retrieve it. Holloway told him not to reach. Darius said he needed to reach to produce the identification. Holloway said he had already been told. Then, at a volume just below a shout, but with a precision that made every word land clean, Holloway said that people like Darius always had a reason, always had an excuse, always thought the rules worked differently for them. Darius asked him to repeat that. Something crossed Holloway's face. A half-second flicker, the visible awareness of a man who has let something out that was supposed to stay in, and then it was gone, replaced by something colder and harder and more deliberate than anger. Darius stated one final time clearly, and without raising his voice, that he was reaching for his military identification. The shot cracked across the empty lot. He went down beside Pump 5. His wallet had not moved. 14 hours earlier, the kitchen light in the Ashford house on Calvert Street was already on at 6:15 in the morning, the way it always was when Darius was home, because Darius had never learned to sleep past 5:30 and had long ago stopped trying. He stood at the counter with a mug of coffee going cold beside him, methodically moving through his bag the way he moved through every pre-departure check, methodically unhurried in the specific order he had developed over years of preparing for things where forgetting something small could become something large very quickly. Travel orders, identification, phone charger, laptop. The folder with the briefing documents for tomorrow's meeting tabbed and organized the way he organized everything he considered important, which was most things. Nadia appeared in the doorway at 6:48 years old, and still half asleep, wearing the oversized Fort Caldwell shirt she had stolen from his drawer 3 weeks ago and claimed as her own without apology or negotiation. Her hair was in 2 braids that had survived the night better than anyone had a right to expect. She had her mother's eyes wide set, direct, the kind that noticed things, and she had developed over the past year a habit of asking questions that adults spent a great deal of energy learning not to ask. She climbed onto the stool at the counter and looked at his bag with the evaluating expression of someone conducting an inspection. "You're checking it again," she said. It was not a question. "I always check it again," he said. "Mom says you check everything 3 times and you think twice is enough. Your mother is right about most things. She says you say that, but you still only check twice." He looked at her across the counter, and despite everything, the early hour, the long drive ahead, the weight of what the next 2 days required, he felt the specific kind of warmth that his daughter produced in him without effort or awareness, the kind that settled into his chest and stayed there even after she had gone back to bed or school or wherever the day took her. He poured her a small glass of orange juice and slid it across the counter without being asked. Adrienne came downstairs at 7, dressed for work, her movements efficient and quiet in the way they always were in the early morning before the day had fully started asking things of her. She kissed Darius on the side of the head and looked at his bag and said nothing about the checking, which was its own kind of comment. They had been married 11 years, long enough to have a complete language made of things not said. At 7:30, when the bag was finally packed and the car was loaded and the morning was running the way mornings run when departure is coming, Darius crouched down in the doorway to say goodbye to Nadia, who had migrated from the kitchen stool to the couch with a book she was not really reading. She put the book down and looked at him with those eyes. "Will you be back before I go to sleep?" she asked. It was the question she always asked. It was the question whose answer was almost always no, and she knew it was almost always no, and she asked it anyway because asking was its own kind of holding on. "Not tonight," he said. "Maybe tomorrow night if the meeting runs short." She nodded, accepting this with the particular dignity of a child who has learned to accept the particular shape of her parents' work, even when it costs her something. Then she leaned forward and wrapped both arms around his neck and held on for 3 seconds longer than a casual goodbye, and he held back with exactly the same pressure, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said. He stood up. He picked up his keys. He walked to the car. In the rearview mirror as he pulled out of Calvert Street, Nadia was standing on the porch in the Fort Caldwell shirt, one hand raised, watching him go. Adrienne stood behind her with one hand on their daughter's shoulder. He watched them until the street curved and they disappeared. The highway was straight and dark and mostly empty at that hour, the kind of drive that gives a person more space to think than they sometimes want. And Darius drove it the way he drove most things, without music, without distraction, with the quiet self-containment of someone who had spent enough time in environments where noise was a liability that silence had become his natural state. He was 38 years old. He had completed 2 overseas deployments with the 82nd Airborne, led a unit of 14 soldiers through conditions where the margin between a good decision and a catastrophic one was measured not in minutes but in seconds, and come home both times with a record that his commanding officer had once described in an annual evaluation with a single sentence that said more than a paragraph could have. The kind of officer you want in the room when nothing is going according to plan. He had been stationed at Fort Caldwell for 4 years. He drove home when the calendar allowed it, which was less often than Adrienne would have preferred and more often than the Army technically required. He wore his rank with the specific ease of someone who had earned it through the kind of work that does not require an audience, and he had never in 4 years at the post, or 11 years of marriage, or 38 years of living, been the kind of man who led with what he was before he had to. What almost no one outside a specific set of offices in Washington knew about Darius Ashford. What was not on the bumper sticker, not in the small talk at the post, not in the way he introduced himself at Nadia's school events, was that 8 months ago he had been appointed to serve on the Federal Military Conduct Oversight Board, a body with the authority to investigate misconduct within law enforcement agencies that operated in coordination with or under contracts affiliated with the armed forces. The appointment had come through his commanding general. It had come because of the work Darius had done on 2 internal review panels over the previous 3 years' work that had required him to sit across from men who had done things they should not have done and ask them without flinching and without theater to account for what they had done. He was good at that. He had always been good at that. The meeting he was driving toward, the one that had put him on this highway at this hour with his phone at 9% and his tank running low, was a working session with a United States senator who was moving a federal oversight reform bill through committee, a bill that, if it passed, would expand the board's jurisdiction to include any law enforcement agency receiving federal funding. Any law enforcement agency, including the Holt County Sheriff's Department, including the department commanded by Sheriff Brandt Holloway, who had been serving Holt County for 9 years, and whose record, had anyone been looking at it carefully, told a story that nobody had yet required him to explain. Darius had not mentioned any of this to Adrian before he left. Not because he kept things from her, he did not as a rule, but because he had learned through the particular discipline of his work not to speak about things that were still in motion, and because the habit of not leading with what he was had become so ingrained that he had stopped noticing he was doing it. He did not lead with it. He never led with it. He pulled off Route 9 at 11:07 because the fuel gauge was low and the phone was at 9%, and home was still 50 miles ahead, and the Sunoco lot was lit up against the dark like a small white island in the middle of everything. He pulled to Pump 5. He did not know what was coming. The Sunoco on Route 9 was the kind of place that exists on the edge of every county. Not a destination, not a landmark, just a function. A lit rectangle of concrete and pump islands and refrigerated shelves standing in the dark between one stretch of highway and another. The kind of place you only remember because something happened there. The canopy overhead threw white light straight down onto the concrete, hard and flat, illuminating everything beneath it, with the indifferent clarity of a machine that does not distinguish between what deserves to be seen and what does not. Beyond the canopy's edge, the night was thick and dark and very quiet. The way rural dark is quiet, not the absence of sound, so much as the presence of a specific kind of stillness that makes every small noise carry farther than it should. Darius pulled to Pump 5, the third from the left, and cut the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel, the way you sit for a moment after 2 hours of highway when your body needs a beat to agree that it has arrived. Then he got out, moved to the pump, swiped his card, entered his PIN, and waited for the machine to think it over. Inside the station, through the glass, Owen Garrett was restocking the refrigerated shelf along the back wall. Owen was 24 white, midway through a 10-hour overnight shift with a half-finished energy drink on the counter and the particular slow-motion awareness of someone who has been awake since 3 in the afternoon and is now operating on momentum rather than alertness. He glanced through the glass when Darius's headlights swept the lot. A man at the pump. Ordinary. Going about his business. Owen went back to the shelf. Darius stood beside the car phone in hand, watching the battery percentage. The way you watch something you cannot do anything about. Mild resignation. No urgency. Aware that the charger in the car would handle it once the tank was full and the road resumed. His sidearm sat in a hip holster on his right side, visible worn openly exactly as active military regulations required for personnel in transit on official orders. He had checked it at the start of the drive the way he checked everything once, methodically, without ceremony, and had not thought about it since. He was not watching the road when the headlights came in. He heard the cruiser before he saw it, the specific quality of an engine accelerating towards something rather than arriving somewhere, the sound of intent rather than arrival. And then the lights came on, blue and red, sweeping across the glass front of the station and bouncing off the pumps and flooding the white concrete with color, and the siren gave one short declarative chirp that said, "Attention and authority," and went silent. The cruiser stopped behind Darius's car close enough to block the driver's door. Sheriff Brandt Holloway stepped out of the cruiser the way he stepped into every situation with the unhurried, grounded certainty of a man who had been the highest authority in every room he had walked into for the better part of 3 decades, a man who had never developed the habit of pausing to gather information before forming a conclusion, because the forming of conclusions had always come first, and the information had always arranged itself around them afterward. He was 54 years old, built broad and solid across the shoulders with platinum white hair, cropped short and close, and the kind of weathered, fixed-set face that comes from years of operating in a county where everyone knows your name and almost no one questions your judgment. He carried himself not with arrogance. Exactly. Arrogance implies awareness of the possibility of being wrong, but with the settled absolute confidence of a man for whom that possibility had simply stopped occurring as a real option somewhere around the time he turned 40. He did not approach the way a trained officer approaches an unknown situation, scanning neutral, open, gathering information before drawing any conclusion. He walked directly across the concrete toward Darius with the focused, purposeful step of someone who had already reached his destination in his mind before his feet got there, and his eyes, from the moment they cleared the cruiser door, had gone to the holster on Darius's hip and had not moved. Darius turned slowly, both hands coming up at once without being told, palms open and forward at shoulder height, fingers spread, every movement deliberate and announced. He asked in an even and level voice what the situation was. Holloway told him to step away from the vehicle. Darius said he was fueling. He asked the basis for the contact. Holloway repeated the command. Darius stepped away from the vehicle, hands still raised, voice still level, and asked whether he was being detained and on what grounds. The question landed badly. Holloway's hand moved to his holster, not drawing but resting there, a statement rather than an action, and he said he was not going to ask again. Darius stated that he was carrying. He stated the weapon was legally holstered. He stated he was active military on official travel. He stated that his military identification was in his left breast pocket and asked specifically and clearly how Holloway wanted him to retrieve it. Holloway told him not to reach. Darius said he had to reach to produce the identification. Holloway said he had already been told not to reach. The instructions contradicted each other in the specific way that certain instructions in certain encounters are designed to contradict each other, leaving no compliant path, no correct response, no action that does not become in the report filed afterward a failure to comply. Darius registered this. He had been in rooms where the instructions and the desired outcome were two entirely different things, and where the gap between them was the actual danger. He kept his hands where they were. Then Holloway said it, not shouted, not muttered, but spoken at a volume just below a shout with the deliberate precision of a man who knew exactly what he was saying and chose to say it anyway, that people like Darius always had a reason, always had an excuse, always thought the rules were somebody else's problem. Inside the station, Owen Garrett had stopped moving. He had set down the bottle he was holding. He was at the glass now, his phone already in his hand, his stomach telling him something that his brain was a half-second behind on understanding. Darius asked Holloway quietly and without expression to repeat what he had just said. Something moved across Holloway's face, brief, visible, the flicker of a man who knows he has let something out that was supposed to stay in, and then it was gone, replaced by something colder. And Holloway told Darius to reach for that weapon and see what happened next. Darius stated for the last time with complete clarity that he was reaching for his military identification. The shot broke across the lot before the sentence finished. Owen Garrett flinched back from the glass. The bottle he had set down rolled off the shelf and hit the floor. He stood there for 3 seconds that felt like much longer, his phone already unlocked in his hand, watching Darius go down beside Pump 5, going down slowly, not falling, lowering the way a man goes down when his body has been hit and his mind is still present and still trying to manage the situation. Darius lay on his back on the concrete. Both hands were still empty. His wallet had not moved. His left shoulder was bleeding, and his face was turned upward toward the flat white light of the canopy overhead, and he was conscious, and he was still. Holloway keyed his radio. His voice was steady and professional and contained none of the emotion that had been in it 30 seconds ago, because the voice he used on the radio was a different instrument than the voice he had used on the lot, and he had been using both of them for a very long time. Shots fired. Suspect down. Suspect was reaching for a weapon. The word suspect did what that word always does in a report filed before the ambulance arrives. It renamed a man without his knowledge, turned a shooting into a procedure, and made everything that followed harder and slower and heavier than it needed to be. Owen dialed 911. His hands were not steady. He kept his eyes on Darius, and he kept the line open, and he did not look away.
Bumadid.
If what you just saw made something move in your chest, if you are sitting there thinking about what happens in this story when the camera is not rolling, then stay with us, because what comes next is where this story stops being about one man at one pump on one Wednesday night and starts being about something much larger. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss how this ends, and share this with someone who needs to see what accountability actually looks like when it finally shows up. Keep watching. The investigative team arrived at the Sunoco on Route 9 the following morning and worked the lot, the way experienced investigators work a scene methodically, outward from the point of contact, treating everything within 50 feet of Pump 5 as potentially significant until proven otherwise. The exterior camera was mounted on the canopy support post, directly above Pump 5, angled downward at approximately 40 degrees, positioned to cover the pump island and the approach path from the lot entrance. The footage quality was better than the investigators had expected from a county roadside station, sharp enough, bright enough with a timestamp running in the lower right corner that did not waver. They pulled the footage and watched it together in the mobile unit parked at the lot's edge, and they watched it without speaking because there was not a great deal to say while it was running. The footage showed Darius Ashford's hands from the moment Holloway's cruiser lights activated until he went down beside the pump. His hands were visible for the entire duration. They were raised. They were open. They did not move toward his weapon or toward his pocket or toward anything at all. His wallet did not move once, not a shift, not a partial reach, nothing. The Pump 5 camera had captured everything Holloway's report said had happened, and had in the process captured that none of it had. Owen Garrett sat in his personal vehicle in the station parking lot for 11 minutes before getting out and walking to the investigative tent. The investigators knew this because a county vehicle equipped with a dash camera had passed the lot entrance at the relevant time and captured his car idling in the back row with the engine running and no occupant visible through the windows. They noted the 11 minutes without comment and waited. When Owen came to the tent, he handed over his phone before anyone asked him for it. He did not make a production of the gesture. He simply held it out, unlocked with the video already open. The recording was 37 seconds long. It was vertical, slightly shaky shot through the station's glass front door from the inside, and it was clear enough. Holloway's voice was audible. The phrase "people like you" was audible. Darius Ashford's hands were visible at the moment the shot fired, raised open, unmoving. The investigators asked Owen why he had started recording when he did. He thought about this for a moment. Then he said his stomach had told him to. He was not more specific than that, and he did not need to be. Holloway's own body camera presented a third piece of the record and a complication of a specific kind. The camera had been activated 6 seconds into the contact, 6 seconds after Holloway's boots hit the concrete, which was itself a violation of department protocol requiring activation upon exiting the vehicle. The late activation meant the camera had missed the beginning of the encounter, the initial commands, the first exchange. The investigators noted this as a procedural violation and set it aside in the folder where such things collect. What the body camera had captured was the final 11 seconds before the shot. 11 seconds in which Darius Ashford, in a voice that was audible and clear and carried no panic and no aggression, stated that he was reaching for his military identification. The shot fired before the sentence finished. The timestamp was precise. The gap between the last word Darius spoke and the sound of the discharge was 1.3 seconds. The district attorney assigned to the case reviewed all 3 sources in the first 48 hours. She watched the Pump 5 footage 3 times without saying anything. Then she told her team to pull everything Holloway had ever filed. Every report, every contact log, every complaint. Everything going back to the first day of his tenure in Holt County. What nobody had fully accounted for was what happened to Owen Garrett's footage between the time he handed over his phone and the time the investigators completed their initial documentation. Somewhere in the movement of people and information through the tent, and then through the department's internal network, a copy of the 37-second video made its way to a local journalist who had been covering the story since the 911 dispatch was logged. The journalist posted it with a brief description and no editorial. Within 36 hours, it had moved far beyond Holt County. Accumulated a number of views that made local television coverage feel quaint, and generated a volume of public attention that transformed the DA's handling of the case from a quiet internal proceeding into something conducted in full daylight, whether anyone in that office preferred it that way or not. At Morrow General Hospital in the surgical waiting area on the 3rd floor, Adrian Ashford was aware the video was spreading because 3 different people had sent her messages about it within the same hour. She did not open her phone once during the time Darius was in surgery. She sat in the chair closest to the window with Nadia asleep across 2 seats beside her, her daughter's small jacket folded under her head, and she kept her eyes on the hallway door and did not look at the screen. The public attention meant that the investigation could not be handled the way 11 prior complaints about Brandt Holloway had been handled quietly internally through a channel that had a reliable way of making things smaller than they were before they came out the other end. This time, the light came from too many directions at once. There was no shadow large enough. The surgical team at Morrow General worked on Darius Ashford's left shoulder for 2 hours and 50 minutes. The bullet had entered at the deltoid insertion point and traveled downward at an angle that brought it within 4 centimeters of the apex of the lung, before stopping in the tissue behind the clavicle. 4 centimeters was close enough that the surgical team did not use the word fortunate until the procedure was nearly finished, and even then they used it carefully. The outcome shifted from uncertain to stable at approximately 2:17 in the morning. At the point when the surgical team was still in their 2nd hour, Brandt Holloway was at his desk in the Holt County Sheriff's Department, completing his incident report. He had been writing reports for 23 years, and he wrote this one with the fluency and precision of long practice moving through the standard vocabulary of officer safety. Failure to comply reasonable fear suspect. Made a sudden movement toward the weapon, the way a builder works with familiar materials, shaping them not to describe what happened, but to determine how what happened would be understood by everyone who read the account later. Each phrase was a structural choice, a framework constructed before the foundation had been examined. He filed the report at 1:49 in the morning. He went home before 2. He had 11 prior reports on file in that county. Every one of them had held. The morning of the 2nd day, the phone rang in the office of the Holt County Chief Investigator at 8:17, and the number on the screen was a Washington, D.C. area code that the investigator did not recognize immediately and then recognized very quickly. The call was from the office of a United States Senator who sat on the Armed Services Committee and had for the past 8 months been working with a federal advisory body on a piece of legislation that would expand the oversight authority of the Federal Military Conduct Oversight Board, a board empowered to investigate misconduct, abuse of authority, and civil rights violations within any law enforcement agency receiving federal funding or operating in coordination with military installations. The person who had been scheduled to present to that senator on the evening of Wednesday the 14th, in a working session that had been on both of their calendars for 6 weeks, was Major Darius Ashford of the United States Army. Major Darius Ashford, who had been appointed to the Federal Military Conduct Oversight Board 8 months prior on the basis of his record conducting internal review panels at Fort Caldwell panels that had resulted in the disciplinary separation of 3 personnel who had believed, until Darius sat across from them at a conference table, that their records were too clean or their rank too high or their institutional relationships too comfortable for the truth to reach them. Major Darius Ashford, whose appointment to that board gave him in his official capacity the legal authority to open a formal federal investigation into any law enforcement agency operating under the conditions the proposed legislation described. Any law enforcement agency, including the Holt County Sheriff's Department. The room where the chief investigator received this information became very quiet. Not because anyone in it was surprised that Darius Ashford was who he was. They had known he was a military officer from the moment Holloway filed his report, but because the specific nature of what he was, the particular intersection of his role and his authority, and the agency that had just shot him, and the report that agency's leader had filed before the ambulance left the lot arranged itself in the room with the specific weight of something that cannot be made smaller, no matter how hard anyone tries. Holloway had not fired at a stranger. He had fired at the person most precisely positioned by law and by appointment to dismantle the protection that had kept Holloway's record intact for 9 years. He had not known this. That fact made it neither better nor worse. What it made it was undeniable. Darius Ashford had not led with this. He had not mentioned it to Adrienne before the drive. He had not used it at the pump, had not said, "I am a federal investigator, and you do not want to do what you are about to do because using what you are as a shield was not something he had ever learned to do, or wanted to learn, or believed should be necessary for a man standing beside a gas pump at 11 o'clock at night doing nothing wrong." Darius came out of the anesthesia slowly, the way people come out when the procedure has been long, and the body is deciding in its own methodical way what to bring back online first. He opened his eyes to a ceiling he did not immediately recognize, and a left shoulder that communicated its situation to him with complete clarity. Adrienne was in the chair beside the bed. She was not crying. She had finished crying somewhere between the parking lot and the third-floor waiting area, and had moved herself to the other side of it to the place where you function because the alternative is not available. She was holding his right hand with both of hers, and she did not say anything when he opened his eyes, just looked at him with the specific expression that contains everything and requires nothing back. He looked at her for a long moment. "Nadia," he said, and it was not a question exactly. "She's here," Adrienne said. "She's been asking." They brought Nadia in a few minutes later. She came through the door in the Fort Caldwell shirt which she had apparently been wearing for 2 days now, and she crossed the room the way children cross rooms when they are trying to be careful and cannot quite manage it. A controlled kind of fast, and she stopped at the foot of the bed. She looked at the equipment first. The monitor, the IV, the bandaging on his left shoulder, thick and white and larger than she had expected. She looked at all of it with the evaluating focus of a child processing something that does not fit the categories she has been given for how the world works. Then she moved around to his right side, and she put her small hand on the edge of the bandage, the very edge where the white gauze met his skin, and she left it there. She did not squeeze. She did not rub. She just placed her hand there and stood beside the bed, and in that small, wordless gesture was every version of "I am here" that an 8-year-old has available to her. After a moment, she looked up at him, and she asked the question that had apparently been waiting inside her since Adrienne had woken her up and put her in the car the night before. "Daddy," she said in the direct, unvarnished voice of a child who has not yet learned to soften a question before it leaves her mouth. "Did you do something wrong?" The room was very still. Darius did not answer immediately. He lay there with the weight of the question settling over him. Not the pain of it, though there was pain in it, but the specific responsibility of it. The understanding that the answer he gave in the next 30 seconds would become one of the things Nadia used to understand how the world worked for the rest of her life. He told her no. He told her he had done everything right. Every instruction followed, every word chosen carefully, every movement announced in advance. He told her that sometimes a person can do all of that, every single thing they are supposed to do, and still be hurt when someone with authority has already decided who they are before they speak. He watched her face as he said it. He watched her take it in. He did not know whether she fully understood. He knew he would have to explain it again as she got older, as the world gave her more context for what it meant and more reasons to need to understand it. He also knew that she had stood at the foot of that bed and put her hand on his bandage before she knew the answer to her question, and that this, the fact that she had chosen to stand with him before she knew, was the most important thing that had happened in that room. Between the night at Pump 5 and the morning the trial began. 8 months passed, and those 8 months did not pass the way time passes when life is proceeding according to plan. They passed the way time passes when one person in a household has been taken partially out of commission and the other person has quietly expanded to fill every space that was left open, not because anyone asked, not because anyone made a decision about it, but because the children still needed lunches packed and the mortgage still needed to be paid, and someone had to decide what to do about the leak under the bathroom sink that Darius had been planning to look at when he got back from the drive. Adrienne went back to work 5 days after the surgery. She arranged Nadia's pickup schedule around her hours. She attended the parent-teacher conference in November alone and sat in the small plastic chair across from Nadia's teacher and listened to a glowing report about her daughter's reading level and her classroom participation, and answered questions about how the family was doing with the careful, composed honesty of a woman who has learned to calibrate how much truth a given conversation can hold. She signed the medical forms. She tracked the physical therapy schedule, 3 appointments a week. Then 2, then 1 progress measured in degrees of rotation and percentage of strength recovery. All of it moving on the timeline that Darius's body chose, rather than the one either of them would have preferred. She sat in the waiting room during the appointments and worked from her phone and did not complain about this not once, because complaining required energy she had allocated elsewhere. She also, in the evenings after Nadia was in bed, allowed herself 20 minutes in the kitchen with the lights low and a cup of tea going cold on the counter to simply be tired. 20 minutes most nights. Then she rinsed the mug and went to bed because tomorrow was already arranged, and it did not arrange itself. Nadia developed the habit gradually enough that Adrienne did not notice it for 3 weeks, and then noticed it all at once in the way you notice something that has been there long enough to become background, before it suddenly isn't background anymore. Whenever a police vehicle passed on the street outside the house in the parking lot of the grocery store on the highway when they were driving somewhere, Nadia stopped whatever she was doing and tracked it. Her eyes found the vehicle the moment it entered her field of vision and stayed with it until it was gone. She did not say anything when she did this. She did not point or ask questions or show any outward distress. She just watched with the quiet, careful attention of a child who has learned that certain things in the world require monitoring. Adrienne saw it the first time in the grocery store parking lot. She stood beside the car with 2 bags in her hands and watched her daughter stand perfectly still following a county cruiser, with her eyes as it moved through the lot, and felt something move in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived somewhere between them. She mentioned it to Darius at the next visit. He listened without interrupting. Then he sat with it for a moment, the way he sat with things that did not have easy responses, and then he said he understood. What Adrienne saw in his face when he said it was the thing that would cost him the most in the months that followed. Not the shoulder, not the surgeries, not the physical therapy, but the specific weight of knowing that his daughter had learned something about the world from what had happened to him, had added a new category of caution to her understanding of how things worked, and that no verdict and no sentence and no institutional reform would fully unteach it. Adrienne made the decision about Nadia weeks before the trial began, the same way she made every decision during those 8 months quietly, with complete clarity without consulting anyone who might have told her the choice was unnecessary. Nadia would not sit in the courtroom, not because she wasn't old enough to understand what was happening, not because Adrienne thought she needed to be protected from the truth. Nadia already knew the truth in the version appropriate to an 8-year-old, and she had held it steadily. But there are things a child does not need to witness firsthand in order to know that her father was right, and the inside of a courtroom on the day the man who shot her father sits at a defendant's table is one of them. She told Nadia the night before, sitting on the edge of Nadia's bed in the small lamp-lit room, with the science fair ribbons on the wall in the simple and direct way she had learned to tell her daughter. Things that mattered. The trial was important. It was where the truth would be told by many people in a room with a judge, and Nadia would be at school, and at the end of the day, Adrienne would tell her everything that happened. Nadia had listened. Then she had asked whether her dad would be okay. Adrienne told her yes. She said it without hesitation because she believed it, and because the version of okay she believed in was the one that did not require a specific verdict to be true. The next morning, Adrienne dropped Nadia at school. In the drop-off line, Nadia got out of the car, shouldered her backpack, then turned and leaned back through the open door, and hugged Adrienne around the neck for a long moment longer than the drop-off line typically allowed for, and neither of them said anything. And then Nadia ran through the gate and was gone. Adrienne drove to the courthouse. She found the third-row seat she had been told to take. She arranged her bag under the chair. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. The DA's team spent 2 weeks going through the complete record of Brandt Holloway's 9 years as sheriff of Holt County, and what they found was not a single event or a single bad decision or a single moment of pressure that had produced a bad outcome, but a pattern documented in fragments across a decade of logged contacts filed, complaints, margin notes, and institutional responses that told the story of a man whose behavior had been visible and reported and addressed with the reliable inadequacy of an institution that found the behavior inconvenient but not inconvenient enough to actually stop. 11 complaints in 9 years, 3 for excessive force, 4 for conduct carrying what the complaints described as racial bias, and described in those terms not by civilians filing from outside the department, but by fellow officers who had witnessed the behavior and filed their notes through internal channels, believing, as people tend to believe in institutions they belong to, that the channel would produce a result. It had not produced a result. It had produced a series of notes that were reviewed and recorded and closed in the same motion, like mail sorted and discarded in a single gesture. A supervisor's handwritten margin note from 2018 read in full attitude issue counseled. That was the sum total of the institutional response to a complaint that had taken 2 officers more than an hour to draft. In 2020, a black motorist named Gerald Purcell had been pulled from his vehicle during what the initial contact log described as a routine traffic stop on County Road 7. He had been handcuffed and held on the roadside for 41 minutes before being released. No citation was issued. No explanation was provided. Gerald Purcell filed a civil complaint the following week. Holt County settled the complaint for an undisclosed amount 14 months later. Holloway returned to active duty the week after the settlement was finalized. His badge was not suspended. His duties were not modified. The settlement from the county's perspective had resolved the matter. The DA's team also found a private group message thread shared among a small number of officers within the department, including Holloway, that had been running for approximately 3 years. The language in the thread was careful in the specific way that language is careful when the people using it understand that carefulness is a form of deniability. No direct statements, no explicit targets. Nothing that required no interpretation to understand. References to cleaning up certain areas of the county. References to certain categories of driver requiring proper handling. A shared image captioned without text that did not require a caption to communicate its meaning to anyone reading the thread in context. The county had not failed to notice Brandt Holloway. It had noticed him, processed him, paid for him, and renewed him repeatedly across 9 years. Every time the cost of continuing to employ him proved lower in the immediate calculation than the cost of stopping. Deputy Cole Whitfield was 29 years old. He had been with the Holt County Sheriff's Department for 4 years, had been added to the group message thread in his second year by a senior deputy who described it as the real department chat, and had been in it long enough to know what it was and not long enough or not brave enough to have done anything about it. He watched the Pump 5 footage alone in his personal vehicle, parked outside the department building on a Tuesday evening 2 days after the footage had been confirmed by the investigative team and 24 hours after it had started moving across the internet. He watched it on his phone with the sound on and the screen brightness turned up, and he sat in the car for 20 minutes after it ended without getting out. His daughter was 7 years old. Her name was Lily. She had her mother's hair and his nose and a laugh that started in her stomach before it reached her face, and she was at that moment at home with his wife, probably already in bed, probably already asleep in the house on Brindle Road where she had lived her entire life without yet learning the particular kind of awareness that Nadia Ashford had recently been forced to acquire. Whitfield sat in the car and thought about this. He went to the DA's office at 8 the following morning. He did not call ahead, He did not bring an attorney. He walked in and told the receptionist who he was and said he needed to speak to someone in charge, and he sat in a waiting room chair for 22 minutes until someone came to get him. He placed his personal phone on the conference table. He laid out 6 pages of printed screenshots from the group thread. He placed a signed written statement beside them. He did not describe what he was doing as courage. When someone in the DA's office later asked him why he had come in, he sat with the question for a moment and then said simply that it had taken him too long, and that was the most honest thing he could say about it, and he would spend a good part of the years ahead figuring out what to do with the time he had already lost. The courtroom filled before the doors opened to the public on the first morning of the trial, and the people who arrived after the seats were taken stood along the back wall without complaint or instruction, because they understood what morning this was, and they had come to witness it in whatever form witnessing was available to them. The gallery did not make noise. It held itself with the specific, concentrated quiet of a room full of people who have been following a story for 8 months and are now present for the version that will be told under oath with evidence in front of a jury, and they are not going to miss a word of it. Holloway sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that fit differently than his uniform had fit. The uniform had organized him, given him a shape and a context, and the suit without the badge and the county seal on the shoulder gave him back to himself in a way that removed a great deal of the architecture he had been using. He sat still. He kept his face neutral. He watched the door. Darius entered from the side corridor with a slight forward tilt in his left shoulder that 8 months of physical therapy had improved, but not resolved. The therapist's most recent notes projected a 70 to 75% return of full mobility on a timeline that extended past the end of the year. He moved carefully and deliberately. He sat straight. He did not look at Holloway. Adrienne was in the 3rd row on the aisle, close enough to see his face clearly. The seat beside her was empty. The seat would stay empty all day, and the people around her understood why, and nobody said anything about it. The defense worked with what it had, and it worked with it as well as it could be worked with, because this account does not require a weak opposition to make its point. The truth does not become truer when the alternative is poorly argued. The defense argued that Holloway had encountered an armed individual alone at night in an unlit perimeter, that the visible holster had constituted a legitimate source of concern for any officer in that situation, that the encounter had escalated in ways attributable in part to Darius's deliberate responses to Holloway's commands, the requests for clarification, the invocations of his rights, the specific and methodical way he had stated his position at each step, and that a split-second decision made under those conditions could not be judged with the clarity that hindsight and video footage provided to people watching it comfortably in a courtroom 8 months later. The defense made these arguments fully and seriously because they were the arguments available. The prosecution responded by playing the footage, not a clip, the full 16 seconds. The Pump 5 camera angled downward, showing everything from the moment Holloway's cruiser lights activated to the moment Darius went down. His hands raised open, motionless from first to last, his wallet stationary throughout. Holloway's approach, direct, certain, purposeful eyes fixed on the holster before any other information had been gathered. The final seconds, Darius's voice stating clearly that he was reaching for his identification, and the shot cutting the sentence in half. Then the prosecution placed the 2 prior contact logs on the projected screen beside the paused footage. 2 encounters documented in Holloway's own department in the same county, in the same circumstances, armed individuals approached at night with visible holsters. Both resolved without any weapon being drawn. Both individuals documented in the contact logs as white males off-duty military reserve. The prosecution's closing argument did not use the word racist. It used the word consistent. It asked the jury to identify what was consistent across Holloway's documented record, what was consistent in his behavior across 9 years and 11 complaints, and what was consistent about the one variable that distinguished Darius Ashford's encounter from every prior contact of the same type that Holloway had on file. When the prosecution asked Darius to give his victim impact statement, he stood, and the courtroom did the specific thing that courtrooms do when a man who has earned the right to be angry in front of a crowd refuses to perform anger. It got very quiet and stayed there. He described the first surgery. He described the second surgery, which had been unplanned, which had become necessary at the 6-week mark when a complication developed in the tissue around the clavicle that the first procedure had not fully addressed. He described what it felt like to lose the use of your dominant hand's entire supporting shoulder for 4 months, the specific daily granular loss of it. Not the dramatic version, but the ordinary version, the version where you cannot lift a bag of groceries, or carry your daughter, or reach a shelf above your head without someone making a decision about whether to help you. He described what Adrienne had carried. He did not use the word sacrifice because it was not large enough for what she had done, and because she would have objected to it anyway. He described specific things instead: the parent-teacher conference, the bathroom sink, the 4:11 in the morning that Nadia had gotten sick in November, and Adrienne had handled everything alone and had not woken him because he was 3 days post-surgery, and she had decided without consulting him that his sleep was more important than her help. He described Nadia's new habit with police vehicles. He described it without interpretation, without editorial, in the plain, factual terms of a man reporting an observation, and the courtroom received it in the silence that plain facts sometimes produce in rooms full of people who understand exactly what they mean. Then he described the morning at the hospital. He described Nadia standing at the foot of the bed, in the Fort Caldwell shirt, putting her small hand on the edge of the bandage, and then looking up at him and asking in the voice of an 8-year-old who does not yet know how to soften a question whether he had done something wrong. The courtroom did not move. Darius described finding the words. He described sitting with his shoulder immobilized and his wife's hand in his, and the specific weight of knowing that the answer he gave in that moment would become part of how his daughter understood the world for the rest of her life. He told the courtroom what he had told Nadia, that a person can do every single thing correctly, every command followed, every right exercised carefully, every movement announced in advance, and still be harmed when the person holding the authority has already made a decision before the encounter begins. He said he did not know whether Nadia had fully understood that morning. He said he knew he would have to explain it again more than once as she grew older and the world gave her more context for it. He said the part about teaching his daughter to live in the world that had produced the night at Pump 5 did not appear in any medical record he had ever seen, and he thought that was worth noting. Then he turned to face the bench directly and addressed the judge without theatrics and without volume, but with the complete grounded attention of a man who has one thing left to say and intends to say it precisely. "How does a county sheriff have less discipline in a parking lot," he said, "than a soldier has in a combat zone?" The courtroom stayed with that for a moment. There was no good answer to it, and everyone present understood this, and the silence that followed was the sound of a room full of people not pretending otherwise. The jury deliberated for a day and a half, and the verdict came in on a Thursday morning. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations committed under color of law. Holloway sat at the defense table and received the verdicts as they were read one after another, and the thing that happened in his face was not dramatic. It was not a collapse or a visible break. but it was there, and it was very small, and it was perhaps the most human thing about him that the gallery had seen in 2 days of trial. He had walked into every room for 30 years with the certainty that the authority in the room was his. This room had given that certainty back to someone else. He received this information with the face of a man who has just understood for the first time that a thing he believed was permanent was not permanent at all. He was escorted out through the side door. He did not look at Darius as he passed. The judge did not make a long speech before sentencing. She had the reputation of a person who considered length in a courtroom an indulgence, and she lived up to it. She said that Brandt Holloway had been entrusted by the people of Holt County with authority over every person who lived or traveled within it. She said he had used that authority across a documented 9-year period, not as a public trust, but as a private instrument applied with a consistency that the record left no room to describe as coincidental or situational. She said the record did not ask for leniency. She said she did not intend to supply it. 30 years, the maximum sentence for attempted murder in the first degree under the statutes of that state. The gavel struck. Holloway was led out. The courtroom exhaled. 3 of Holloway's prior arrests were referred for review within the week following the conviction. One resulted in a vacated charge. The individual, a 31-year-old man named Dion Ferris, had served 15 months on a charge built on the framework of a Holloway report, and he walked out of a county administrator's office on a Wednesday afternoon 17 months after he had walked into a county courtroom on a different Wednesday, and nobody from the county called ahead to tell him he was coming. Deputy Cole Whitfield submitted a formal transfer request on the day of sentencing. He did not resign. He believed in the work he told himself, and he intended to keep believing in it somewhere that did not require him to walk past the desk where Holloway had filed his reports for 9 years. The transfer was approved within 3 weeks. The supervisor who had written attitude issue counseled in the margin of a 2018 complaint, filed a public statement of resignation that did not ask for forgiveness and did not claim ignorance, and did not use any of the language that public statements of resignation typically reach for when the person writing them is trying to make the past look smaller than it was. He said he had been in possession of information that could have changed the course of what happened, and he had made a choice about what to do with it, and he would have to live inside that choice. And he did not think anyone was obligated to feel sorry for him about that. The Holt County Sheriff's Department announced 3 departmental reforms in the month following the conviction mandatory body camera activation from the first moment of any public contact. A publicly accessible complaints registry, searchable by name and incident type, and an independent civilian oversight panel with subpoena authority. The 3 advocacy organizations operating in the county issued a joint statement noting that they had formally requested all 3 of these reforms over the preceding 5 years and had been told on multiple occasions by multiple administrators that the current procedures were adequate and that the requested changes were unnecessary. They did not use the word vindication in the statement. They used the word documented. They said that the requests had been documented, and the refusals had been documented, and the consequences of those refusals had now also been documented, and they intended to make sure that the documentation remained visible to anyone who wanted to understand how Holt County had arrived at this particular moment in its particular history. In the weeks after the conviction, more people came forward. A mechanic from the east side of the county who had been stopped 11 times in 5 years without a single citation. A retired teacher who had filed 2 complaints in 2019 and never received a written response to either. A postal worker retired now who had kept a personal log of every stop, 16 entries over 7 years, none resulting in any charge because he had understood early that records were the only thing that survived a channel designed to make things disappear. Each of them had tried. Each of them had sent something through a door that led to the same room where things were made smaller. What had changed was not that the door had become more receptive. What had changed was that this time the thing that went through it had been too large and too public and too documented for the room to contain it. 6 weeks after sentencing, Darius Ashford returned to limited duty at Fort Caldwell. His left shoulder was at 68% of its pre-injury range of motion, and he did not mention this to the new recruits he had begun working with, not because he was hiding it, but because it was not the point of what he was teaching them. He taught them the practical distance between knowing what the law says you are entitled to and being able to hold on to that knowledge at 11 o'clock at night in a lit parking lot when the commands are contradictory and the person giving them has already decided. He stood in front of those rooms and told them that composure is not the absence of fear. It is what you use instead of it when fear is not useful. The Federal Oversight Reform Bill moved through committee with Darius's written testimony in the record, and when it passed the Senate floor in the spring, his name was listed among the contributors in the official report. He did not attend the vote. He was teaching a class. Holloway entered state prison on a Tuesday. He had been the final authority in every room he walked into for 30 years, and the room he walked into now had a number assigned to it. Owen Garrett gave one interview a local paper 2 weeks after sentencing, and then asked not to be contacted again. He said he had not done anything that required further discussion. He said he had simply not been willing to watch something happen and say nothing about it. He went back to work. Whitfield continued in law enforcement in a different county with a different set of expectations about what the job required. Expectations he was still in the process of learning to meet. The supervisor who had written the margin note became a private citizen. He had no statement left to make. On a Saturday in late autumn, Darius and Nadia walked home from the park 2 blocks from Calvert Street, and a county cruiser moved through the intersection ahead of them, slow routine going about its ordinary business. Nadia walked beside her father with her hand in his, and the cruiser passed and she did not stop. She did not track it with her eyes. She did not slow her step. She looked up at her father for a moment, just a glance, just a checking in the way children look at the person they trust most in the world to confirm that the world is still holding. And Darius looked down at her and nodded once the way you nod when something that has been broken is beginning slowly and imperfectly and without any guarantee to hold. Her hand stayed in his. They kept walking. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath at Pump 5 or sitting with Nadia at the foot of that bed, then you already know why these stories matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the ones that don't make the front page, but should. And drop a comment below if the cameras had not been rolling that night. Where does this story end? Because most of the time they're not rolling, and most of the time nobody asks.